Reda Cherif y Fuad Hasanov, economistas senior del Fondo Monetario Internacional. Apuestas ambiciosas para el crecimiento acelerado.
Let's sit here. Yeah. Yes, it's good. Yeah, we sent. Oh, we did. Okay. Hello, everyone. I guess they're preparing the slides. I guess we can start before the slides are put up. Okay. So great to be here in Colombia. Sorry, guys, I don't speak Spanish, so you have to, I guess, either listen to the translation or hopefully you speak English. So our talk today is about technology, innovation, and basically industrial policy, and kind of the symbiosis between the state and the firm. So I'll pass it on to Reda. He'll start the discussion, and then hopefully you'll see the slides, and we can talk more.
Buenas tardes. Lo siento, mi español no es lo suficientemente bueno hoy, pero si me invitan nuevamente el año que viene, maybe next year. So thanks a lot. All right. So basically with Fuad today, we will talk about development and growth. And usually when you think about growth, you look at long-term growth and you see what happens to different countries and compare them. So if you look at the performance of Colombia over, let's say, the last 30 or 40 years, we can see is that there's some consistent growth. But then it becomes interesting when you compare, let's say, Colombia to other countries. For example, Chile, Malaysia, and then more interestingly to Korea. And then what you notice is that up to the mid-80s, Colombia actually was richer than Malaysia and Korea in terms of GDP per capita, right? And was pretty close to Chile. And then something happens in the mid-80s where basically Malaysia and Chile start growing faster than Colombia, but more important, Korea really takes off, right? So their GDP per capita starts growing much faster, and it just never really stopped. If you think beyond the GDP, so most countries have, some growth over the years, but if you think about catching up with the frontier, and that's important because, most people in most countries, their ambition is that for this generation, and more important for the next generation, to catch up with the standards of living of, the richest countries. So to do that, you look at, for example, the GDP per capita of Colombia as a share of the GDP per capita, let's say, of the US. And then what you notice is that for the last 4 or 5 decades, the GDP per capita of Colombia have been hovering around the same number, about 20%. And that's basically the threshold of middle-income countries. Now, again, if you compare this to other countries, something happens in the mid-80s, and what happened is that Korea start catching up, and they go from 20% of the US GDP per capita to 50% of the US GDP per capita, which is the threshold to become an advanced country within a decade, right? Malaysia and Chile do a little bit better, but still after 3-4 decades, they're still at about 40%. Today, Korea is almost at 80% of US GDP per capita. So in other words, what is it that happened in the mid-80s that made Korea jump to this next level, become an advanced country, while most countries are still hovering around this middle-income level, and that's what we call the middle-income trap, right? So that's the idea today with Fuad. We'll try to discuss this, discuss the experience of the Asian miracles and what can we extract from this experience for Colombia in general, but specifically for Barranquilla. So let me start with an experiment, right? So most people think they know what is needed for growth, right? And that's what we call the standard growth recipe. So in other words, let us imagine together that today Barranquilla all of a sudden can have the best infrastructure in the world, or among the best infrastructure. Let's imagine that it has the lowest taxes, right? That it has very light regulation. Access to labor, the best labor and the unskilled labor, the cheapest labor and the most skilled labor. Let's imagine all of this happening relatively quickly. Do you think if we manage to have all these ingredients together, this will be sufficient for Colombia, but specifically Barranquilla, to move to the next level and become a high-level country? If you agree with this statement, please raise your hand.
Vote.
Yeah, so let's say a good 20% here.
So let me try to answer this question. No, in a way, here. So what we argue is that standard policy advice is not sufficient, because the usual advice that we give, improve regulations, provide public goods, infrastructure, education, human capital, this stuff is important. And that's what many people think is the only necessary thing that is needed, and that would be sufficient to have high growth. What we argue, that is not enough. And one interesting example is if you look at rich oil exporters, like Gulf countries, Kuwait, and others. Kind of in the book we did about 10 years ago, we essentially show that they did all of these things to a large extent. Good education, good infrastructure, very low regulations, can bring any labor, low taxes, and still their productivity wasn't improving, actually was stagnating. They were not growing as much as they should have, and they were actually losing ground relative to many other countries. So they were used to be 5 to 7 times US GDP per capita, and now they're about the same. So what economists say that is also important to have high sustained growth is what is known as market failures. And this is essentially firms trying to go to sophisticated sectors, but they won't go because there are many kind of bottlenecks of the firms doing so. So essentially, like say, high fixed costs to enter very sophisticated sectors, like say, semiconductors. To build a factory in semiconductors, you need billions of dollars. So no firm will be able to go in. So what we need is what we call kind of the leading hand of the state. The state intervenes, and the Asian miracles, kind of Korea and Singapore, who managed to pull it off, kind of give us a blueprint of how this could be done.
So one thing, a lot of people thought the Asian miracles just followed the standard recipe. As Fuad said, in fact, if you look at their history, they all targeted specific sectors.
So here's the second question. Maybe, we can ask you if you think that all sectors are the same. Should the state intervene equally in tourism, agriculture, services, or should it focus on sophisticated sectors, like advanced manufacturing, electric cars, advanced renewables, and relevant supply chains? What do you think? So should are all the sectors equal? So how many people think it's the same?
Okay. All right. So I guess we agree on this. So if you look at the experience, again, of the Asian miracles, Korea, Japan, Singapore, the first element that's very clear, they were obsessed with exports. It was really about export, export, export. And there are many reasons for that. First, think at the level of the country, exports provides hard currency, which is very important, right, for imports, and then all the goods you need to raise your living standards of living. But then this is also true at the level of the company. Think of a company that focuses on, let's say, a non-tradable construction company. Think of a company like Hyundai. So Hyundai in the 50s was still a construction company, and then it turned into this giant automotive. So imagine if Hyundai remained a construction company in, at that time, was a low to middle income country. And fast forward today, would it have the market valuation of $44 billion and one of the biggest companies in the world? Of course, this is not the case. Why? Because by orienting companies toward exports, what happens is that you free yourself from the level of income of your environment. You have access to a global market, much richer markets, huge opportunities, right? So that's the first element. The second element from their experience is sophistication. So the Asian makers all focused like laser beams on sophisticated sectors. So what do we mean by sophistication? So we measure it simply by the R&D intensity. This is spending on R&D as a share of sales. And where you can see this, these are the data based on the US, and these are the R&D intensity of different sectors. You can see that there are very few sectors that have high R&D, right? This is electronics, chemicals, automotive, and machinery. And lo and behold, these are exactly the sectors the Asian miracles focused on. Now, these sectors are important. Fuad, can you come back? These sectors are important compared to the non-sophisticated sectors such as agriculture and tourism because they provide three things, right? Complexity. These activities are very complex. They entail a lot of linkages with other firms. They're dynamic. They keep changing all the time, right? Tourism is the same today, like yesterday, like 10 years ago, or 100 years ago. But sophisticated sectors change all the time. And then finally, scale, right? They have to be done on a large scale, which means employing a lot of people and paying good wages that keep increasing. The third element was going beyond their comparative advantage. We know a lot of experts believe we should just focus on comparative advantage, but the experience of the Asian miracle showed that they went way beyond. When they entered the electronics and automotive industries, they were actually middle and sometimes low-income countries. So they went far beyond what they could do at that time, and that's what led to their future success. And then finally, it's a matter of strategy. It's not about abandoning what you do well now, but it's really using both, going into quick wins, sectors that are already working now, helping them improve, but at the same time making those bets, those strategic bets on the future.
Yeah, so just to add one element, so there is a lot of focus on, say, tourism and services, and it makes sense to do so in the short run, to help generate growth in the next few years, for example, but it's not going to be sufficient to generate this high sustained growth going into 5, 10, 15 years from now. And we see it if we look at the past. There was growth in Colombia, in many other developing countries, emerging markets, but it was just for a time, and then it was kind of going back to where it used to be. So to generate this high growth, kind of focusing on these quick win sectors like tourism and some services, maybe even agriculture, is not enough. You have to think about preparing the ground for these transformative sectors, leapfrogging to high tech, moonshots even to the technology frontier, and so on. And this requires a lot of steps because it takes time to get returns from investing in those sectors.
All right. Now, we know that a lot of countries focus their attention on FDI. So they look at some success stories, let's say like Vietnam, and the belief is that by focusing on attracting FDI, we will grow fast and move to the next frontier. Again, I'll try this poll very quickly. How many people believe that just focusing on FDI and attracting FDI is enough to go to advanced country status? Please raise your hands. I guess one. Perfect.
Two. So FDI is important, of course, and that's essentially what we saw in many countries. And you saw earlier Malaysia, you saw it also in many countries in Latin America. Costa Rica is also an interesting case with Intel. So it does help you to get to a certain level, but it's not enough. It gives you growth, but it's not enough to generate sufficient growth to allow the country to get to advanced country status within a short period of time. And that's essentially about domestic technology creation. It's about innovation, and not just any innovation. It's about innovation by local firms, homegrown innovation, domestic technology creation. And this just a chart of patents that were filed in the US by these countries, Malaysia, Korea, and you see completely different dynamic compared to many other countries. Even Malaysia, that was actually bringing a lot of electronics to the country, but it was mostly multinational corporations, didn't generate enough technology and innovation.
Yeah. Actually, in fact, Japan and Korea had regulation that were discouraging FDI for a very long time, right? So it doesn't mean FDI is not important, but they managed to grow very fast, actually, while discouraging FDI.
So kind of what we hear now a lot is, in the US, Europe, elsewhere, so the question now is, so to generate technology, local technology, should we kind of engage in protectionism? Should we put in tariffs or other barriers so that local firms supposedly may have an opportunity to do so, to develop technology? So that's kind of the key question. Is protectionism the answer? And many people may think so, but...
Yes. So here we use the comparison between Malaysia and Korea, again around the 70s and 80s, when they had relatively similar levels of development. Both countries went to same industries, automotive, at around the same time, with the same capabilities. But they had very different kind of paths, right? On one hand, the Malaysians relied on import substitution. So they created a national champion, Proton. They protected it and helped it a lot. It had some agreements with Japanese firms. They were importing the engine for a while. So on some level, it was a success, right? They were producing cars, local cars, but they were forcing, right, consumers to buy these cars that were more expensive, not necessarily at the frontier of technology. But more important, after 30, 40 years, they still relied on the important Japanese engine, which was a very important element. At the same time, they survived through implicit subsidies, right? So either the consumer was paying the price or the government was helping them. Now, if you compare to the Korean strategy, they also went into automotive. They also have their companies, but they had a very different strategy. First of all, they pushed all these companies to export almost on day one, or very quickly. So they had to export. They had to export to the most difficult market in the world. They had to export to the US and gain market shares. The implication of that is that companies like Hyundai had to innovate quickly. Although they started also with agreements with Japanese firms to import engines, within a decade, they were designing and producing their own engine, which meant they were more vertically integrated, which meant they were more competitive. And then we know the success of Hyundai. Finally, what's also very important to differentiate between Malaysia and Korea is that while Malaysians relied basically on one champions, the Koreans had different companies going to automotive. All the chaebols, these are the conglomerates in Korea, started an automotive company at some point. Actually, most of them failed. The only one that survived is Hyundai, that became an international champion. So the conclusion of the story is that failure is part of the path, right? Some companies can fail, but the sector itself will survive and produce an actual champion that's competitive internationally.
So just to add, I guess the key point here is that even though, for example, Korea used to protect its market early on in the 60s and so on, but it's the focus on exports that created completely different incentives for firms to compete globally, to improve their production practices, management practices, reduce their costs, and compete globally because they didn't have much choice. They were competing with top Japanese and US and German and other European car companies. So it's really this export orientation that is key. And protectionism actually, we argue that it reduces competition and creates this complacency. So even though you may be protecting the market, hopefully giving some support to the firms to improve technology, reduce costs, and compete, in reality, most likely it won't happen. At least what we see in terms of the evidence from the past, including in Latin America and many other countries, these are essentially import substitution policies of the past. They have failed. And it's really about focusing on global markets and focusing on exports. So another question is then, all right, if we're going to focus on exports, we're going to focus on technologies and so on, then should we kind of gear or kind of reorient our policies, the state policies, toward SMEs, small and medium enterprise. So this is kind of a big thing. Many people that, oh, let's support SMEs. That's where growth is. It's going to be enough. Do we think so or not?
So basically what we'll present next is data on the OECD, comparing the best performers in terms of R&D. Few observations. The first one is that the countries that innovate the most, of course, are the ones that spend the most on R&D, 2, 3, 4% of GDP. But what's very important to note is that most of this R&D spending is done by the private sector, not the public sector, right? Most of it. So public sector is important, but it's mostly done by companies. This gives you a snapshot of which companies are responsible for most of the R&D. So what it tells us is that most of the R&D is done by domestic firms. This comes back to the point raised by Fuad earlier. So they are domestic firms, not FDI. The second point, which is very important, is that most of the R&D is done by large firms. Whether it's Finland, Nokia, in Korea, Hyundai, for example, right? Or in most countries, you have a very large firm responsible for a very, very, very large firm of R&D. Then the third element is that these firms are in high tech and manufacturing. So that gives you kind of an idea, a sketch of the type of firms that have to be targeted, or at least that had to be created, right? To generate this type of R&D spending that would lead to innovation and then high growth. So that leads us to the next question, which is, can we build clusters, right? Can we build innovation clusters? Can we build industrial clusters around these, high-tech sectors? So the question now is, do you think Barranquilla, can create a cluster, or is it something that just will be created organically, no? So can it be done? And to answer this question, we can look at experiences of other countries.
So one question maybe I can ask you guys first. How many are from kind of the industry, high-tech sectors here? High-tech sectors.
Okay,
so,
nobody.
Yeah, maybe a few, but I guess that's kind of what we're trying to portray here, kind of to project. The idea is that how do you develop these industry clusters? And is it just organically? So these small startups, SMEs, you can think of them at some point. The idea is how do you grow them so that these become large firms? Google used to be small, Amazon used to be small, they became huge firms. So how do you grow them? One way, it's about kind of creating clusters. And Singapore's story kind of illustrates that, where you had not just the role of the state, where they would create the committee, trying to figure out what was needed, the bottlenecks, but this committee would also include the firms, the private sector, the other professionals, the academia, basically, probably civil society to some extent, to figure out how could it be done. And then the focus would be to how do you alleviate the bottlenecks? What are the problems? So Singapore did that. They've created the research institute. They partnered with industry, brought in FDI, initially big pharma firms, started sending a lot of people for PhDs in biotech, and so on, created the right infrastructure called Biopolis so that they have the labs, they have the equipment, they have everything. So all these guys who can come back and work, and it wasn't just PhDs, it was also technicians, so all the skills that were needed, and right instruments. So how do you create the instruments for startups, scale-ups, support that they will need to export, produce, and many other things. And of course, the legal framework and all the other regulatory issues that came with it. So it's essentially the whole thing. So it's not just, let's fix regulation and things will be great, or let's fix education and things will be great. It's actually everything, but it's focused on the sector that you're trying to build up.
So the experience of Switzerland with their two major engineering schools, ETH and EPFL, helps us a lot to understand the type of blueprint to develop these innovation clusters around universities. So, of course, there's large investment in basic science, right? And the fact that these universities are great, but at the same time, there are decisions that can be made to link these universities with the ecosystem. For example, there are programs to give grants for firms to actually collaborate with researchers in the universities and work together in the labs of the university to produce patents, new technology. So these kind of links can be immediately done, right? You don't need a university in the top of the Shanghai 500 ranking to start doing that. The second thing is that having an industrial park or actually a startup incubator close to the university helps. It sounds kind of as something not very difficult to do, but you'd be surprised that it's very difficult for a young startup to actually rent a place. So these things really matter in the beginning. And then putting together all the legal framework, which is a proper technology transfer office at the university to help researchers actually produce patents and commercialize them. So that leads us to the kind of last proposition, right? Which is to ask, can the state really act as a venture capitalist? Is it too risky for a middle-income country to bet on these high-growth, high-risk sectors for the future?
So I guess the question is, this is a tough one, no? I mean, is it too risky? We said that was the title of our talk, no? It's ambitious bets. Is it too risky to undertake? And what we argue is, if you take this mindset of venture capitalists on a state level, so it's not really about every project, every firm succeeding. It's really about the sector as a whole. So failures are fine as long as the sector succeeds, because the failure means learning. People move to more successful firms. If you give support to one firm that cannot make it, then reorienting support to another firm that is more successful, have more chances of success. And at the end, that's exactly how the venture capitals work. All you need is one success, and then you kind of catalyze the whole industry, the whole sector. And that's basically the story that you see here about Taiwan, that today that we see TSMC, their biggest semiconductor foundry that produces chips, started. And it started essentially with the state, with the help of the state, where they would send people to the US to understand the technology, they would license the technology, and then they will actually experiment in-house, and then they'll spin it off. And TSMC was one of those companies that was spun off in the 80s and became quite successful today. And this effort was led by this research institute, Industrial Technology Research Institute, and that's also important because they would coordinate all the important actors, all the important policies, instruments to make sure that the industry succeeds.
So the important point is that whether it's Korea or the Taiwanese economy, they had similar levels of development and income to Colombia in the 70s and 80s when they took off. And at that time, they entered into these very ambitious sectors, very highly advanced. So now the question is, how do you do it? I guess few conclusions. First, export, export, export. That was the total dedication, both of the private and the public sector at that time. As Fuad said, it's about picking sectors, but not picking particular firms. A lot of firms will fail in the process, but the sector will survive. And then as we saw with the example of Singapore, for a sector to succeed, let's say biotech, a lot of things have to happen at the same time. That requires coordination of all the stakeholders, all the public goods, but also a lot of communication between the public and the private sector about what is actually needed to succeed. And then in the end, it's about what people like Hadron Chang call purpose-specific investment, right? A road is great, a harbor is great, a port is great, but it has to be part of a network and a system to produce and a sector to succeed. Well, with this.
So if kind of just to conclude the last idea here, kind of summarize what Reda just said, if we want to create these young, growing firms that grow, become large firms, multinationals, grow and export and produce everywhere and create the jobs that are needed, creating this high, sustainable, and also inclusive growth for everybody to participate in. It's exactly this coordination of firms, academia, civil society, and the state, how to put it all together through different ways, clusters, innovation ecosystems, but also these are kind of longer term, but also shorter term, where you have kind of productivity improvements, management improvements in existing sectors, kind of quick wins, where you can improve, create growth enough so you can focus on the next stage. Korea used to export textiles all the way to the 90s, when they were already producing cars and doing electronics. So it's about kind of the strategies of doing quick wins, but also focusing on transformative gains and moonshots. And essentially, that's what Andy Grove, the late founder of Intel, said. No, in today's world, you gotta either adapt or die. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you.